we weren't. Wouldn't
I
that
was just
just be wouldn't that just be so terrible if the whole time we were not actually streaming because I forgot to hit a button? Hey, what's going
that's
on? Sorry.
it's all right. It's
Oh
all right.
man.
I was just noticing on my side thing here, and I was just like, oh, it's not moving.
Hey, we're
Okay,
back.
yeah. Oh,
Let's just do the whole let's go back.
okay. So we're on the air now.
We are totally on the air. Look at me screwing that up.
All right. Hi. Welcome to another episode of Fear and Loathing in the Windy City. We just had a great 10 minutes of content that might get recorded because that's just the kind of tight operation that we run here.
That's really where we're at, I think. Oh man.
All right. Well, we didn't cover much. How we meander.
We
More importantly,
we started with talking about what Solarpunk is, which just
mhm,
like from my understanding now, it's just the movement that surrounds trying to create a more green and environmentally friendly culture. If I'm my reading that one right?
yes.
Yes.
That's the Google answer to it. It is just it's idea building, it's world building. It is a movement that's counter towards the status quo that wants to move aggressively and optimistically towards environmentally sustainable systems. How you couple that with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in light of so many uh, recent racial uh, death murders. Right now hangings that are being called suicides. That we'll talk about more in Hardlands Media, but it is modern day uh, lynching, Ku Klux Klan terror. It's terrorism, and like I mentioned, like in a war is a war of ideas. You need ammunition. Solar punk is just an umbrella term to kind of coin and funnel a lot of the major ideas of environmental sustainability over for-profit systems of what you call human rights and indigenous values over colonization of the land and people's minds. Um, it's meant, it's all pretty nebulous and pretty early of a term. Doesn't mean anything, but it's meant, these episodes are meant to world build a little bit of a tool for it to mean something.
It's a movement that is in its fledgling beginnings. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good way to
you
put
know
it.
yeah, you can't add enough to it just yet. And I did want to focus a little bit. We've been talking a lot about hemp, a lot about industry, a lot about logistics, hemp obviously being a focal point that's being missed right now in the Green New Deal talks. And, when we're talking about solar as opposed to fossil fuels, we're not talking about hemp as a immediate substitute to biodiesel, to ethanol processes. Um, and we want to talk about why hemp hasn't been brought into the table has largely been because of the war on drugs. The war on drugs is very specific, a war on people's indigenous relationship to this land, and a large part of, in some ways, their spiritual beliefs. It was a war against people. It
Hmm.
wasn't a war for anyone's sound, mental health. At the
Yeah,
end of the day,
that was what I said. Very responsibly before we started streaming.
it was really good.
By accident, it was really is that like I come from a sort of lower middle class area. I was raised in Arkansas, and it was not very hard to get by, right? And uh, so the privilege that sort of came with that is, I always viewed the war on drugs as just the blanket term of like it's a war on drugs. Like what could be such a big deal? Drugs are bad. Everyone knows that, right? But what you find once you look back is that the war on drugs really all it inevitably became was just another version of a race war, the same race war that the government of the United States has been propping up for since its inception.
Yes. And moreover, it was meant to put it into a very boring kind of bureaucratic process very normalized kind of language in which crime, danger always meant imminent death, in which case any kind of response, police fearing for their lives, imminent death in response to anything of that sort, was normalized.
Mm-hmm.
The war on drugs, and then we talked a little bit about pop culture and the way that it normalized, especially at inflection points in these discussions, even further. If you look at pop culture in the 60s and 70s, you could probably, with a modern eye, better discern, oh, that helps civil rights' cause. Oh, that kind of like acquiesces to the status quo. Oh, they're kind of playing both sides here. Oh, at the end, they kind of want to settle on the status quo. The same is true of media today. I want to ramble through this point, but social media has created a generation of more content creators. I think more people are just aware of how you create content with intent and how you consume it, and it's a lot harder for mass media to just pull one over on the way people, considering the way people use social media today.
It's actually funny. Daniel and I were talking about this just like an hour ago. Maybe we were talking about how the climate that we exist in today has sort of perfectly allowed the Black Lives Matter movement to sort of actually take hold and actually affect some change that we're starting to see. And I don't think that without social media, without everyone having a camera, just on them all the time, I don't think that that would be even possible. Just imagine having an iPhone during the civil rights protests.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we also have to appreciate the fact that people didn't seek to Martin Luther King as a leader because that was like the ultimate strategy. He just had the discipline and the longevity of the fight to be that leader, and there wasn't a whole lot of other strategies that were as effective as someone like him able to really elucidate to white America, how this is meant to be a march for peace in America, to cease the violence against Black Americans. And because of the tools that we have today, a leaderless movement in the Black Lives Matter movement is effective, is able to hold itself to somewhat account. I think there's a lot of skepticism over like, oh, don't donate to this fund. Oh, this kind of endeavor, Blackout Tuesdays, like celebrity led. Oh, like these performative things that you see in DC are not to be bought. There's a constant shift of accountability to it. That you're right. Social media you know lets it succeed. And my hope with these episodes is that people that are involved in these long-term fights are able to just have a consolidated place, to ruminate through these ideas in the hopes that, as they push forward, these ideas become more polished and a lot more asserted in the mainstream and the shorthand, as we've seen with a lot of issues from Medicare to all for all to, Black Lives Matters, demanding now an abolishment of the police now and having a lot more public, what you call buy-in for that than we have seen, at any time in American history.
And I've like largely due to the fact that I don't think I think it's impossible to open up social media and not see just blatant disregard of people's rights, and which is something that it took that happening, like during the 60s and 70s, it took the media actually propping that up for people to actually start to see why it was causing problems. That's
And I mean, and it's been nearly a decade of this. Like at my early 20s, I had a lot more optimism of the world just fixing its problems and me finding a place in it, to help with that.
mm-hmm.
A lot more difficult, realizing after a decade of like, there's a whole lot more areas in the world to destroy life and planet, and if you want to make your way through it. And it's a lot harder to make your way through other means, and it shouldn't, because the earth provides everything that you possibly could need. So like, why participate in such a destructive process? And hopefully these tools that are connecting more people around the world, a lot more than they've ever been, is a means to change that. I have a very sci-fi kind of optimistic uh, hope for the world of the future, not necessarily Star Trek, but
Do you think there's a place in the world for the sort of performative measures that we see, like through, like our own government or other government? Do you think that there's perhaps a place where that's actually useful?
like performative measures can be impactful. Like a lot of the statues that were toppling down were performative measures, but
Mm-hmm.
in the opposite direction. It was the South reasserting its reasoning. I mean, like the South was very clear in its reasoning for leaving the Union. All of it referenced slavery. Like it wasn't
As
subtle.
as much as people want to try and deny that, oh, it was for people's rights,
Yeah,
it was not.
it was not subtle. They weren't like tiptoeing around like I don't know, guy. I have a lot of feelings about. No, it was just like slavery is our way of life. We subjugate human beings, and we like that, and we're not going to stop. And screw you for telling us to stop.
Yeah, screw you for
Um,
taking money out of our pockets.
oh my
Like,
god, taxes.
oh
I mean,
man.
uh, the ideas are in America as a colonizing project. I don't think it's something that America is self-reflective of itself enough. But
Agree.
a lot of my reasonings for being the weirdo that I am is that America does have a weird relationship with Latino population in the sense that they're like, we really would like it if you assimilated to white culture,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not going to treat you white till a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets very complicated and messy, and America has its own way of doing that, but Latinos are already kind of used to that from the way it's done in Latin America, because it's also very racist and white supremacist. And
Imagine
it, it
that.
it gets very messy. But like there's enough to here, to hold America to account a little bit, um, and much needed account, because this war on drugs, this militarization of the police, all of it justified by the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is guided a lot by the foreign policy that the CIA set out early in the United States against Latin America specifically. Um, is the detrimental and destructive to the planet and to life on Earth and to people and to society, to peace, to life. So like, let's just
And to like
keep.
people's overall, how are you supposed to trust that people are going to be there for you and that humanity is good, right? How are you going to put your faith in that argument if at every turn you see a contradiction to that?
Precisely, and that is kind of at the root of like why this becomes a bit of a spiritual war. The CIA was founded by very religious sects of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a principleless organization. They're just psychos.
Yeah.
But I think we should get started on that first clip. I always want to forget to it.
Never. Okay. So this is the part we finally made it to the end of our long list of clips, but this is the clip that specifically talks about the war on drugs and kind of what we're leading into here.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, modern usage of the hemp plant centers around only one of its many uses, its ability to alter consciousness. Like the other uses, this is also not a recent phenomenon.
The oldest domesticated plants are the drug plants. We have historical evidence that they were domesticated by people before food crops. In various cultures throughout history, marijuana has been used, valued, because it was a doorway to other states of consciousness.
It's a blessed plant. It's a blessed plant.
It can give you a little happiness.
Marijuana has been an important religious sacrament throughout Africa, the Middle East and Asia for thousands of years. In Hinduism, the god Shiva is said to have brought cannabis from the Himalayas for human enjoyment and enlightenment.
शिव शिव जितना पी उतना जीव जे न जाने गांजा के कली लड़का से लड़की बम बम
Why
Really
then is
token it there.
marijuana use so controversial in Western culture?
marijuana cultivation and use in Europe probably was mainly as a fiber plant.
Sometimes the
and food
marijuana's
plant.
just smoking
And it's
weed,
very
right?
possible that many people who grew it for fiber and for seeds did not
know
know
that
of its
deal.
use as a psychoactive drug.
Terence McKenna is a leading researcher and author on the traditional uses of psychoactive plants.
The absence of a straightforward hallucinogen or psychedelic in the flora of Europe has given Western
We have a
man a kind
timestamp.
of particular
+42,
horror
51.
of the kind of boundary dissolving experiences
Got about a
that
minute.
attend these plants. Another factor is the Christian church. The reliance of magical folk practitioners on plants was consistently suppressed by the church. So we have evolved our peculiarly alienated form of science and social polity completely in the absence of any connection back into the magical side of nature that Celtic and earlier peoples were very concerned to cultivate. So this, I think, is the source of our particularly destructive relationship to the earth and our particularly alienated state of social relationships among ourselves. Only 100 years has Western humanity and civilization actually grappled with the dilemmas which these substances pose. So we're at the beginning of making an adjustment which many traditional societies made a comfortable accommodation to millennia ago.
Our beginning to make an adjustment has been a rough one.
There you go. It's been a rough one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can pause it there because I'm going to go a little bit more into the punitive measures. So, Terence McKenna kind of gets into the whole out-of-body experience of it all. I recommend YouTubing Terence McKenna and just going down a rabbit hole.
I can definitely do that. I'm capable.
Yeah, no, do it. Gen Z, like honestly, go nuts, man, because these are not new conversations that people are having around cannabis, around drugs, around legality. These are not new conversations by a long shot. What's new is that the science is out in the sense that we don't have any academic papers on cannabis the way that we should. Cannabis has been officially illegal of any use, including medical use, since 1970. 1970. Not that long ago at all.
Almost in my lifetime.
Almost in all of our lifetimes. And really at the heart of a lot of what the problems is with the police, where they use this prohibition on cannabis as a Schedule I drug as an excuse to harass and target communities that we see may have historic uses and needs and acclimation to this plant for various needs. Now that we can accept, that it has some Western medicinal use, the leap, that people would make that, it has always been kind of a sustainable, holistic, had medicinal use for people. It's not outlandish. It was outlandish to say that in the 1980s.
Even the 90s. I mean, it's leading all the way up to in my lifetime in the community that I was raised in. Like my family still is staunchly against marijuana, mostly just because it's illegal. So they have like a moral objection to it, because it's not a legal thing, but it's just because of their, people are not educated on the actual uses of it. And you're right. I mean, it's just because the government decided one day a long time ago to say, we'll make it illegal and then we won't have to worry about it.
I shared an article, and I think we are sharing these in the comments, right? But I mean, they're just Wikipedia articles to, the legal history of cannabis. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 formally, regulated marijuana for consumption in America, whereas before it was just kind of a very informal plant that was always informally used. You know, in like 1619, you have King James decreeing the colonists of Jamestown to step it up, help England, and we desperately need hemp. You know, these are not foreign plants. Mexico, you know, got introduced to cannabis by Spain, you know, in growing hemp, and a lot of those psychoactive properties became part of, uh, part of us, spiritual ceremony.
I
Um,
feel like I listened to a thing once a long time ago about how a lot of people assumed that marijuana was, or the term marijuana was, what was it? Not racist, but it was supposed to be a bad term, or it was supposed to
Derogatory.
delegitimize something like that. It was derogatory. That's the word.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's the word. But it actually comes from indigenous peoples after becoming subjugated by white people, right? They needed to disguise their uses of it, right? But they were growing hemp anyways for the machine, right? And so they discovered that you could actually get some hallucinogenic qualities like what they had been experiencing before being subjugated in ayahuasca, stuff like that. They had forever been using that, and then Spain came in and said, "No, you can't do any of that because Christianity is all about this, but you have to grow this plant for us." And so they started disguising it by calling it marijuana, which is like the plant of Mary or whatever. So as long as it was related to Christianity in some ways, it was totally fine.
Interesting. Learn something new every day.
Nice.
I believe that. I mean, what you call it? Christianity that had opium dens and marijuana taxes, you know, in England and Europe on the regular. But it is a continuation of just colonization.
Mm-hmm.
How do you colonize these people to obey you? And when you said, performative, building a church in an indigenous land is kind of a performative act
Mm-hmm.
that can have lasting impact.
Mm-hmm. It
Um, you
changes the
know,
landscape of an area forever. I mean,
and challenges the way that people live. If all the people with means and that arrive and are in charge of you are living in stone houses, and people are still living kind of like in places that are a bit more sustainable to the land and clay huts, you that plays. So so long story to say, like what happened in Washington D.C., Black Lives Matter Boulevard isn't nothing, especially in a country that's as racist as the U.S., as a signal to the rest of the world that really does not believe in the longevity of our democracy project here as a multiracial democracy. Part of what patriotism I do have, what gumption I do have for this land is like, no, screw you. We'll make it work somehow. We'll make this shit work.
that's definitely the idea. People always talk about like, oh, you can't forget about the American ideals, and that's pretty much the only section of American ideals that I still actually believe in, is the idea that we are people who persevere and can work through tumultuous times, and the movements that we're seeing right now are definitely an example of that. And I don't see it stopping anytime soon, right? You can't. Once it's started, we're just rolling down a hill now. You can't stop it.
Yeah, I mean, I really saw the Bernie Sanders campaign as the culmination of the energy of Occupy Wall Street
Mm-hmm.
that really lent itself into Black Lives Matter, that really lent itself into the fight for just housing and against gentrification. It kind of culminated back into Bernie, and then that kind of ending is now you just have an explosion of just like this injustice has to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Has to stop.
You suddenly have hordes of people who are upset that the establishment would stop a change like that they would try and stop a movement like that from happening.
Yeah, and then double down on a murderous status quo, which I think we can continue the clip that we were on to kind of talk a little bit about, our government's response.
Our nation has zero tolerance for casual drug use.
Ooh, George
When I was
Bush.
in England, I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale, and never tried it again.
If you do drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished.
One of the major concerns is drug use among young people.
I think marijuana can make kids space out and lose their concentration, and I think the only remedy for that is good drug education, especially aimed at young people, about what are appropriate uses of it and what aren't. And I don't think it's a good idea to be stoned in school, for example. But we don't have any real drug education at the moment because in the present climate, that's impossible. You can't admit that illegal drugs have any positive uses. And all of the educational materials that are used in schools are designed to scare people away from that substance by exaggerating its dangers, and that doesn't work.
If you tell a 15-year-old that all these terrible things are going to happen to him or her when they smoke marijuana, and they've already tried it and they know that it didn't, why should they listen to you when you tell them that crack cocaine might kill them? I wouldn't have if I was 15 and was misinformed like that.
I think that kind of education has a very negative effect. I think it enormously stimulates curiosity on the part of young people to try the forbidden substance.
Now, I can imagine a few whispers out there. Maybe you think we'll never get drugs under control, that it's too easy for the dealers to get back on the street. Well, those days are over, too. The revolving door just jammed.
And then we unjammed it. We unjammed the revolving door immediately.
For them in jail. We'll make room. We're almost doubling prison space. Some think there aren't enough prosecutors. We'll hire them, with the largest increase in federal prosecutors in history.
America is now the country with the highest rate of incarceration. Approximately 20% of criminal convictions are marijuana related.
There is no inherent psychopharmacological harmfulness of marijuana, which is anyway comparable to the harm of arresting more than 400,000 people, mostly young people, for marijuana transgressions every year in this country.
We will look back on this era and the response to drugs in this country and think that was worse than what happened in the McCarthy era. It is insanity run amok, and there's not a sane voice in the federal government saying anything about it.
All this vigorous prosecution of marijuana, for example, has changed a situation where people grew their own, and usually rather mild marijuana, into a situation where marijuana traffic is dominated by organized crime.
The cash crop in California that is the most profitable is marijuana in California. A number of
Yes.
Cool.
I like the thing about like Bill Clinton saying like, oh, I tried it once and I didn't like it. I didn't inhale. So sorry for you, Mr. President, that you didn't even try it, actually. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, why you messing up, man?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's been our government's response. They really try to formalize the idea of why the illegality of it is such a moral issue.
And I mean, they want to. It's like it's so interesting to watch this and see that even in 1995, there were already people who were talking about how this led to this, led to this, led to a militarization of the police, which led to an influx of George Bush saying, oh, some people say there's not enough prosecutors. We'll hire more prosecutors. We'll beef up this system so that we can stop a drug that we do not understand in any sort of sense.
All they understood was people's predisposition to use it and which populations were predisposed to use it. And that was the populations that they wanted to criminalize.
Mm-hmm.
Nixon's aide is very clear about that. And the thing is that system has become very lucrative to police unions, whose labor has mostly been to hire people that have no qualms harassing people of color and predominantly Black Americans
Mm-hmm.
and Native Americans, who also make up a disproportionate amount of the people that are getting killed by police. Again, always going back to, police being in a situation instigate some violence if their their number one goal is to find some contraband,
Mm-hmm.
and contraband that inherently makes you a violent person.
And if at some point, we're starting to see that, people aren't carrying contraband, well, then that sort of turns into, I guess we'll just plant it on them. And
yeah, sprinkle some crack.
Yes, which is such it's a joke, sort of a jokingly told thing, but I mean, it's such a serious issue that's existed since we started actually cracking down on things like that.
And I mean, that was before cell phones, that was before social media, and that was before any kind of movement building could have any kind of coherent strategy for accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Burning down Target is as close to holding the system accountable as the systems ever have been held.
Yeah. I do not disagree.
There's there was more clips to go through, but I did kind of want to just bring up Loving versus Virginia.
Ooh, all right.
Because we're going kind of heavy here into, yeah, let's start there and we'll go backwards. Yeah.
Ooh, banning interracial marriage.
Yeah. So I think, this is important, I think, to talk about in light of this situation when we're talking about war on drugs, we're talking about sustainable systems. We forget that a lot of American literature, popular culture, world building in of itself centered around race and centered around the scientific, logical, ethical applications that a good Christian colonist would apply to race. And segregation was the norm, was an accepted norm that was challenged over time and really culminated and challenged with interracial marriage being formally, decriminalized.
It's such an odd. It sounds odd, but just thinking back on it, like I was raised in an environment where it wasn't really explicitly told, but it was sort of implied always that it's like, you kind of stick to your own kind, and which was really weird for me because then I found out that I was like biracial. I'm half Mexican, so then it was like, okay, so where do I go in this?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to have this discussion that America has always had a very formalized, segregated, it's always liked its racial identity politics very formalized. Mitch McConnell flat out says that Obama being president was kind of reparations for slavery already. Like,
yeah,
says awful shit like that.
Yeah, we totally fixed it, right?
Problem solved. Like, Latin America is a lot more insidious, and we might I'll try to Google this, but like where interracial marriage was not as overtly criminalized, but it was very socially stigmatized.
Mm-hmm. That's
America as well, but we see with landmark rulings like this, like all Americans, you're going to have a lot of situations where people go against the grain and try to do everything the right way, because I mean, this was not, I'm sure, the first interracial couple to want to really challenge the courts on their love, but they served a year in jail to try to get this heard to the Supreme Court.
That's real love right there. I was just gotta say that's if you're willing to go to jail for what you believe in and who you love, then that's it.
Yeah, everyone just ghosts each other nowadays.
As odd as such a spillover now, like this issue has now spilled into same-sex marriage, which is even actually it even says it in this article that I'm reading in the thing on Wikipedia. It's like it's spilled over. It's now we're not talking about interracial marriage. We're talking about same-sex marriage. We're talking about trans rights. We're talking about any number of those things. But it's still, as the Supreme Court ruled just the other day, people's rights. Plain and simple.
I mean, you can't really stop adults from falling in love and, being in love.
You can sure try, though, I guess.
Yeah, society certainly tries. It's important to remember that, a lot of the war on drugs, remember, marijuana becomes illegal in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
Interracial marriage becomes formally decriminalized in 1967.
Mm-hmm.
What you call it? Sorry.
No, you're good.
And then Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968. So you also have just kind of an escalation of, what led to this formal process that we had with Norm on the war on drugs has so much to do with the times of, the civil rights era, at the height of it, at the very height of it. You kind of have the lead up of, of Martin Luther King really just going towards, full on class consciousness and on national news, national press, and going towards fights of solidarity, dying on that hill. And then you have the aftermath of just the reactionary government of just like, no, how do we stop, this race mixing, commie kids, free love.
That's what you do. You attach communism to it, especially during the Cold War, right? That's what a blanket term to just associate with all kinds of wrongdoing.
Funny enough, Vladimir Putin would be hanging around the U.S. during the 70s, getting intel on us and on all the fallout of our civil rights era, which kind of really makes him the weirdo, creepo insider into our psyche that we are not. But yeah, more on that later.
A different topic, a different day.
But it's important. We're going a little backwards here. We want to bring up let's bring up the article I sent to you on the book Black Boy. It's a book by Richard Wright. It's a memoir of his. It's actually a book that I was assigned to read in 8th grade, and I actually read it, and it left a little impression on me.
You want to? I'm trying to. I've never even heard of this book. In my my Arkansas schooling, never taught me that.
I was fortunate to be in the 7th and 8th grade program at Kenwood Academy in Hyde Park. First time I really left the neighborhood of Little Village when I was a kid, on the regular, going to Hyde Park. This book details it's kind of a memoir from the writer Richard Wright, Chicago native. He made his writing career and his bones here in Chicago, and he had popularized other books on being a Black American. This was from 1945. He focuses a lot on the 1920s, but also just his time growing up in the South, and eventually just his becoming a bit of an alcoholic at 6 years old, and eventually starting to work at 11.
Wow.
Yeah.
Completely foreign concepts to me. I mean, really, honestly, it's...
Yeah, and Grandpa kind of talks smack about things were tougher in the old days. They sound a little rougher.
Yeah.
A little, things might get that rough again. You know, if it makes anyone feel any better. But
You don't have to feel excluded. It could get worse.
right,
There's
you
always
know,
chance for it.
thanks for the stories. Now we have to figure that out when we're your age. But sorry, but yeah, I really recommend this book. At the very least, I really recommend the Wikipedia article. It's it really goes into details of you know, he was a very profound contemporary writer of his time, of you know, especially in terms of communism, in terms of leftist politics, and the blend of identity politics. And it's something that I think that has been missing in the overall DSA official left kind of narrative. Has been an antagonism towards identity politics that I think misses the nuance and the history, especially local history here in Chicago, of what those conversations actually look like. The story culminates with Richard Wright kind of overseeing. He's joined the Communist Party in Chicago at this point. You know, he's kind of an older person, but he's part of a committee that's overseeing the expulsion of a black member from their group, and he doesn't find the same fault that so many of his other members do, and he kind of sticks to, you know, his whole pathway from leaving the South has been leaving the terrorism, because he does talk a lot about the white terrorism of the South, leaving to Memphis, finding the same racism in Memphis, and working his way to Chicago, finding it less racist, but in his journey to free of himself of racism and free others, you know, and working with the Communist Party, finding that it's just too ingrained in human beings and during his lifetime. Really sad. When I read that in 8th grade, I'm like, oh shit, so we're never going to fix racism? That's sad.
So it's never...
I didn't appreciate really what they were trying to tell me, but
I'm now trying to think of what the Huckleberry Finn, that's it. As far as like school reading, and I didn't even read it because I was a bad student. I'm really intrigued by this part of the Wikipedia article where it says at first Wright thinks he will find friends within the party, especially among its black members, but he finds them to be just as timid to change as the Southern whites he left behind. And that's a really, really interesting way of looking at it. That it's you leave one evil and you enter into another evil that's just been placed upon people, you know?
Right. And I mean, you have to remember that that's also part of the Chicago mythology. I mean, like, Martin Luther King took his own kind of journey up to Chicago, and what he found here also dismayed him. You know, Chicago was the idea mecca for Black America, and he found, you know, a middle class of Black America that was complicit with the status quo. That made MLK, like, you know, go more full on commie, like, you know, just like, oh my God, you know, like we got to free all the workers.
That's
you know,
the kind of stuff that you see today. There was that story of, that woman who was arrested and beaten up because a cop was just sitting in her driveway, right? And then I believe it was the police commissioner maybe or something, but he was a black man, and he was just propping up sort of the same ideals that the police hold, right, as a black man. And that just goes to show you that, like, it racism does not just mean white people don't like black people, you know, it does not really even care about what race you are, right? It's just about what gets ingrained up here. It is, and what you're left with is broken people, broken communities, and people who don't know how to even assimilate with their own people anymore.
Right. You want the atomization of people. You want people that's separate from each other, in order for capitalism to continue, and that's exactly how racism perpetuates itself. You know, and these aren't foreign concepts. Again, like, you know, we grapple with them in Latin America, and I bring up Richard Wright and this great book, Black Boy, because I mean, think about, you know, we have a litany of American literature, whether it's leftist identity politics, historical, you know, in terms of, you know, pining towards, the freedom from these institutional racist systems, you know, it's time to draw on where we're at in this fight. Like Richard Wright is writing this memoir in 1945, reflecting, and one thing that did kind of impact me, because I remember kind of wanting to be a writer at an early age, him saying that writing was his only solace and only escape from racism, and truly how he connected to the human experience, believing that in being a great writer and being a writer of note and a thought leader, was the only escape that he had to connect to other human beings away from this institution of racism. And you can't help but imagine, like, people like Martin Luther King, people like what you call it, Malcolm X. They were born in 1929. Richard Wright is an older contemporary of these times, and in the journey to try to understand American racism, you're going to topple around these ideas.
So it's an easy assumption then to say that like people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were directly influenced by Richard Wright, probably.
And we need to operate with the same sense of not just urgency, but of respect, that we're not probably going to accomplish all that we want in this progressive platform, but we are part of a longer narrative towards a march towards civil rights, towards equality, towards sustainability, towards peace. Much in the way that Richard Wright was part of it for the civil rights, and that Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King were. And now we see the response from the government was the war on drugs, formalizing these processes, criminalizing human beings, atomanizing us, to separate us into power dynamics, and all of it being money, money, money. The 70s, Hunter S. Thompson, where this show gets a lot of its influence from, he was a super pro hippie journalist in the 60s, became kind of a deadbeat, not a deadbeat by any means, but a burnout, a purposeful burnout, where he talked about the 70s was the hangover of the high of hopes that America had in the 60s. And then the 80s, where you have greed is good, and Richard Nixon and the rise of Bush and all of that.
The large push into the war on drugs.
Large push into the war on drugs, also the end of the Cold War, the formal end of the Cold War, where we really just got one over on Russia's economy, where World War III was no longer as imminent as we thought it would be. Now it's more imminent than it's ever been.
Yeah.
What you call it? Yeah.
Especially with how it's just plainly unstable the entire world is, especially right now during a pandemic, during a complete recession in the United States, which affects the rest of the world, right? And right now, our relations with other foreign powers are some of the lowest that they've ever been, due to a certain orange guy who yells a lot. And what a melting pot of problems that we exist in.
It's been a long road towards everyone's problems becoming our problems, but if we're just real about it and at least put them out in digestible bits, maybe the next generation can digest them. It's the hope.
Perhaps they can pick up the pieces of the whatever we decide to leave behind, I guess. Yeah.
Let's hope that they find something decent.
I think we have time for, because we can go a little bit longer since, I made a oopsie. We can go, I think, for another 10 minutes. Do you want to talk about Tulsa?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Cool.
Going backwards here, interracial marriage becomes legal in 1967. Richard Wright is writing about the plight of racism, for Black Americans in 1945. The Tulsa Massacre.
Or the Black Wall Street Massacre, the Greenwood Massacre, Yeah.
The article does a big play-by-play. It was a 3-day kind of riot. But like we need to know, just like thousands of Black residents were left homeless, and there was no recourse. There was no repercussion. There was nothing after this.
Jeez, I know bits and pieces about this. I know that it happened, which is an important first step, right? I definitely need to do more reading on it. I also have watched Watchmen, and I mean that whole show is sort of the instigating moment is the Tulsa.
Oh snaps! Gotta watch that.
It's very, very good. I haven't read the comics very much, but it's all like the instigating moment for the entire thing is the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it's a really interesting commentary, I think, on where that has taken us. But it also is like superheroes and stuff like that.
Yeah, the original Watchmen by Alan Moore is it's one of the few graphic novels on Time's 100 Best Novels Ever Written, for a reason. It's good. I recommend it. But yeah, Tulsa, I checked out the HBO show. This was 1921. A little bit more history, like we keep interweaving all this pop culture, but Birth of a Nation, like one of the first, audio movies, the KKK lynching plays a big part of all that. That was 1915.
Yeah.
So just 6 years after that movie, you have the burning down of Tulsa.
I watched Birth of a Nation as like a 10-year-old.
Oh yeah.
Just to I was confused mostly. Because it's not a good movie. It's but it's definitely, and also especially being like a film boy or what, someone who fancies themselves as a film boy or whatever. It is definitely a part of film history. That's not a commentary on whether it's good or bad. I personally, it's racist. It's bad, obviously, but you can't shy away from that whenever you're talking about informative films in American history.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I mean, it goes back to a lot of even though we're doing this kind of sloppily, we are here trying to weave a coherent narrative, because I do believe in the power of story building, and Birth of a Nation movies, films are storytelling. And the fact that so much effort and art making went into telling the story of racial terror towards Black Americans, to support white, fragility, white supremacy. It says a lot of just, number one, how ingrained racism is, as part of culture, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, the fact that, it became a sensation. The influences of pop culture, the way that capitalism uses racism to keep people somewhat acquiesced to the system of having to work for all your basic needs. If people bought into the lie that, you're being oppressed right now, but the South will rise again, because this is you are right. Seeing this kind of murderous punitive justice on the other. People can go about their days, a little easier with, with a little bit, with a sense of pride, which is quite sick.
What happened to your audio?
My audio.
You sound like you're in a tin can now.
Oh no.
I don't really know how to fix that.
Oops.
Oh man. Mute and then unmute you. Hold on.
Unmute it now. Sound a little better.
No, it's still the same, but maybe that's just me. I don't know. Zoom is cool.
Just to point out, though, by the end of 1921, Tulsa had 3,200 residents in the Klan. By one estimate, the city's population was 72,000. So 3,200 people were estimated to be in the Ku Klux Klan in Tulsa. Population of 72,000 was kind of enough to raise that long project of Black liberation to the ground.
Ooh. Yeah, just reading about this definitely. It makes me feel sick. I mean, I don't even, like, what can you really say other than just like what the story is? It's the complete dominance of white culture to establish itself as being the first class, and to sort of a large attempt by white people to make sure that Black people forever be the second class citizen. And
we can get it, and we probably will get into the nitty gritty. Like, white is not a people. It's not a real thing. Like, to the point where, like, Italians were not considered white, Irish were not considered white, Greeks were not considered white. And white supremacy, a lot of the imperialist projects, can be tied to Catholic projects, to Middle Eastern witch hunt civilization project building. The Ku Klux Klan gets its name from the Crusades. I do think that, we're entering a phase, and I do get a little bit like, I do drugs, so I can get like supernatural stuff. The age of Aquarius is where we can start to elucidate these occult, hidden, esoteric kind of truths of life and the universe and our understanding of time as far as humanity. Because, people spend a lot of time thinking about these things and writing them down. And, rich people just, like, oh, wow, there's this whole, like, Pharaoh ruin book about stuff. Okay, go away. But, it's time to just share that out into the masses and trust that human beings, we have the means to just allocate and organize ourselves into peaceful societies. A lot of this militantness towards, against Black lives, and the colorism and social stigmatization and social conditioning and controlling that you get because of that culture of terror is all really just meant to perpetuate the status quo, which is capitalism, which at the end of the day is subjugation, is imperialism, which runs on racism, and that kind of it all becomes. But the hopes is that these conversations, just much in the way that Richard Wright pouring his heart out into his memoirs, in the hopes that it provided an escape for himself, and also a tool for people to continue to use in the same journey that he was on. We're going to keep doing these episodes with the same hopes. And I encourage people that are doing activism work to just do it that way too, because you keep thinking that, like, oh, we have to pass the Green New Deal next year or we're fucked. Yes, you're right, but you'll probably ruin your life.
Yeah, and I mean, I've said this on like Hardlands Media. I think that I've said this on this show too. I mean, it starts with just having conversations, right? Just being like Richard Wright, right? I mean, it started with him having conversations with, I'm assuming, white people, and then eventually moving up to Chicago, and then having more conversation with Black people, coming to the realization that it's so ingrained that it's a hard thing to challenge, right? But there's so many opportunities that I've had to have really good conversations with just strangers around hear about what's going on in the world and what maybe we can do to affect change. And some people are easier to turn and convince, right, that people are people and it doesn't matter what race or any of the things, right? It doesn't, people are people, and that's an easier conversation to have with some people. It's a really hard conversation to have with people who have lived their whole lives under that stigma, right? But it's still an important one to have. And so a lot of people say, like, oh, what can I do, right, to help with whatever. It's one thing is just have those conversations with everyone that work that in somehow, and the more that you do that, the more you can educate yourself about it. Actually go read something. Like, I'm gonna read some of this stuff actually after the show is done, so that way I can become more educated, because it's the least, it's one of the least things that I can do as a person who has sort of existed with the privilege that other people have not, right? And that's a good start. You have to start somewhere, right?
For sure. Good on you, man. And, the more that we put out tools and resources like this for people to continue that education and open up their minds to different connections, the more that we'll just reflexively be living in a world that's harmonized peace and sustainability. Kind of that background noise. Ideally, is the goal.
Well, all right. You still sound like a robot kind of over here, so you want to just wrap this one and say,
yeah.
And then we're gonna we're offline. We're gonna talk more about making this a more organized, more polished sort of operation here.
We're working on a little theme music. We're working on a little bit more segments and ideas.
Now your voice comes back.
Now my voice comes back.
Okay,
man, yeah. Just gonna try with get some interviews of people that are doing really good sustainable work in terms of urban gardening. So we're gonna talk about that soon. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope that these episodes, we're going to do a few more on Solarpunk. I'm thinking like 3 more. Hope this is useful, helpful. Thanks again.
Goodbye.